Sophie Myers had always dreamed of having her own space. After years of sharing cramped apartments with roommates, she finally moved into her very first place. It was a small, cozy apartment with white walls and big windows that let in lots of sunlight. Sophie was excited about living alone, but there was one thing she hadn't expected: loneliness. For the first time in years, there was no one to talk to when she came home, no one to laugh with or share her day. The quiet felt strange. Sophie had always loved animals, especially dogs. She thought about adopting a dog for a long time but had never been in a situation where she could take care of one. Now, with a place of her own, she finally had the space and time to do it. So, a few days after moving in, Sophie visited the local animal shelter. The shelter was full of excited dogs, all barking and wagging their tails. But in the back of the kennel, there was a calm Labrador retriever named Rex. Unlike the others, Rex didn't bark or jump around. He just sat there looking at Sophie with gentle eyes. Sophie was drawn to him immediately. She knelt down and Rex walked over, sniffing her hand before pressing his head into her palm. It felt like a perfect connection. Without thinking twice, Sophie decided to adopt him. Rex settled into his new home quickly. Sophie set up a cozy bed for him near the door, but it didn't take long for Rex to find his way to Sophie's bed. At first, it was just for a few minutes before he would curl up at the foot of her bed. Sophie thought it was sweet, but soon Rex began to stay longer. By the end of the first week, he was sleeping right next to her, his body warm against hers as they both drifted off to sleep. Sophie didn't mind. She enjoyed the comfort of having Rex by her side. It made the apartment feel less empty, and she found herself looking forward to those quiet moments together. It was a simple habit at first, but soon it became part of her nightly routine, and Sophie couldn't imagine going to bed without him. After a few weeks of settling into her new apartment with Rex, Sophie started to feel different. At first it was just a little tiredness here and there, but soon it became more noticeable. Every morning she woke up feeling exhausted, like she hadn't slept at all. Her muscles felt weak, and no matter how many cups of coffee she drank, she couldn't shake the feeling of being drained. Sophie told herself it was just work stress. Her job had been busy lately and she had been working long hours. She figured the late nights and the change in routine from moving into her new apartment were just wearing her out. But as the days went on, she couldn't ignore how tired she felt. Even simple tasks like getting out of bed or walking to the kitchen started to feel like a huge effort. Her head ached and the foggy feeling in her mind wouldn't go away. Sophie couldn't explain why she felt this way, but she told herself it would get better soon. It wasn't just Sophie who was starting to feel off. Rex too was changing. He was always a playful dog, full of energy, and loved to run around the apartment and play fetch. But recently he had been sleeping a lot more than usual. Sophie first noticed it when Rex started spending the majority of the day resting on the couch, barely lifting his head when she walked past. This wasn't like him at all. Normally, Rex would follow Sophie from room to room, always excited to be with her. But now he was slow to get up, his movements sluggish and his tail barely wagging. Sophie tried to encourage him to play, but he didn't seem interested. His favorite toys lay forgotten in the corner, and Sophie couldn't help but feel worried. She began to wonder if something was wrong with him. It wasn't like Rex to be so still, and she had never seen him act this way before. As if Rex's change in energy wasn't worrying enough, Sophie noticed something even stranger. At night, when they would both settle into bed, Rex's breathing sounded different. It wasn't steady like it used to be. His breaths were heavier, almost labored, and Sophie could hear him panting more than usual. Sometimes, Rex would cough softly in his sleep, and Sophie would wake up to the sound of him shifting restlessly beside her. She would reach down to comfort him, thinking it was just a small cold or that he had eaten something that upset his stomach. But the coughing didn't go away, and neither did the heavy breathing. Sophie became more concerned. She thought about taking him to the vet but kept putting it off, thinking it might just be something minor that would pass on its own. However, things only seemed to get worse. Rex started to sleep more deeply, almost as if he was too tired to get up at all. He seemed listless, barely reacting when Sophie called his name or tried to get him to go for a walk. Sophie felt helpless. She didn't know what was wrong with him, but she knew something wasn't right. She was starting to wonder if Rex was sick, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that something else might be going on. She had been feeling strange too, and now she couldn't help but wonder if Rex's health problems were linked to her own. Sophie had always been close to her best friend, Sarah, and when Sarah visited her one afternoon, she couldn't help but notice how different Sophie looked. Sophie's face was pale and there were dark circles under her eyes. She seemed exhausted and Sarah could tell that something was wrong. "Sophie, you don't look well at all," Sarah said, her voice full of concern. Have you been sleeping enough? Sophie tried to brush it off, forcing a smile. I'm just tired, that's all. Work's been busy and I haven't had much rest since moving in. But Sarah wasn't convinced. No, this is more than just tiredness. You look really run down. You need to see a doctor. Sarah's concern didn't stop there. She looked around the room and noticed Rex, who was lying on the couch, barely moving. His eyes were half closed and his body was limp. Has Rex been acting strange too? Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. Sophie hesitated before answering. Yeah, he's been so tired lately, sleeping a lot more than usual. And his breathing's been weird at night. Sarah's eyes widened. That's not normal. Maybe something's going on with both of you. Sophie had never really considered that the way she was feeling and the way Rex was acting could be related. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that they were both showing similar signs. She was feeling sluggish and tired all the time, just like Rex. She was waking up with headaches and a foggy mind, and he was barely able to get out of bed. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear that something wasn't right. She and Rex both seemed to be getting worse every day. Sophie tried to dismiss the thought. It's probably just stress. I've been working a lot, and with the move, I haven't been taking care of myself like I should. She didn't want to admit that something might be seriously wrong. After all, she had just moved into her new place and was trying to get everything together. Sophie didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She convinced herself that the exhaustion and Rex's strange behavior would eventually go away. Maybe once she settled in more, things would get better. And by the end of each day, she felt completely drained. It wasn't just physical tiredness anymore. Her mind was foggy and she couldn't think clearly. It felt like something was weighing her down, and no amount of sleep or rest seemed to help. Rex's condition also continued to decline. He was barely eating and his once energetic personality had disappeared. Sophie knew that she couldn't ignore this anymore. Sarah's words kept echoing in her mind, and the idea that both she and Rex might be sick from something in the apartment made her uneasy. But Sophie didn't want to jump to conclusions. Still, she realized she couldn't keep brushing it off. Something was seriously wrong and it was time to take action. Finally, Sophie made an appointment to see her doctor. She hated the idea of going to a doctor, thinking it was probably just stress, but the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. She had to find out what was going on with her body, and with Rex. It was time to face whatever was causing their strange symptoms. Sophie finally decided to take Rex to the vet. She had been worried about him for a while now, and his condition was only getting worse. His breathing had become heavier and he wasn't acting like his usual self. Sophie felt guilty for waiting so long, but she hoped the vet would have answers. She took Rex to the local clinic, a small but clean place where Dr. Hayes, the vet, had been working for years. Dr. Hayes was kind and patient, always taking the time to listen to Sophie's concerns. As soon as they arrived, Sophie led Rex into the examination room. Rex seemed more sluggish than ever, barely lifting his head to greet the vet. Dr. Hayes took a careful look at Rex, running his hands over the dog's body, checking for signs of illness. Rex didn't flinch, which made Sophie even more worried. Dr. Hayes checked his temperature, listened to his heart, and even took some blood samples. After a thorough examination, Dr. Hayes sat down, looking thoughtful. Well, Sophie, Dr. Hayes began, Rex isn't showing any signs of a serious illness. His vitals are stable, but I do notice signs of mild toxicity. Sophie's heart sank at the word toxicity. Toxicity? She repeated, feeling a wave of anxiety. Dr. Hayes nodded. Yes, it's not severe, but he's definitely showing symptoms of being exposed to something that's affecting his body. It could be something in your home, like chemicals or fumes. Without further tests, I can't say for sure what's causing it. Sophie's mind raced. She had no idea what could be making Rex sick. Could it be something in my apartment? She asked, a little panic creeping into her voice. Dr. Hayes looked at her thoughtfully. It's possible. The fact that he's not improving and that his symptoms seem to match yours makes me think there might be something environmental at play. Sophie's mind flashed back to the way she had been feeling over the past few weeks. She had been so exhausted and foggy, and now Rex was sick too. She had started to wonder if their problems were somehow connected. But hearing Dr. Hayes mention it made her realize just how serious it could be. What should I do? She asked, feeling helpless. Dr. Hayes gave her a comforting smile. For Rex, I'd suggest we run a few more tests to get to the bottom of it. It's important to rule out any toxins or poisons in his system. Sophie nodded, thankful for the advice, but she also felt a knot of worry in her stomach. Before Sophie left, Dr. Hayes gave her a piece of advice she hadn't expected. You should also see your doctor, Sophie. If you're feeling sick too, it could be related to the same source. I'd recommend getting a checkup, especially since you're both showing similar symptoms. Sophie hesitated for a moment. She had been putting off seeing a doctor for herself, thinking it was just stress. But now the idea of getting help seemed more urgent. Sophie agreed to make an appointment, knowing it was the right thing to do. As she left the clinic, with Rex by her side, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in her apartment. The idea that both she and Rex were being affected by something unseen made her uneasy. But now she knew she needed to get answers, fast. As the days passed, Sophie's health continued to get worse. The tiredness that had been lingering for weeks now turned into something much worse. Every morning, Sophie woke up feeling just as exhausted as the night before, and by the afternoon the fatigue was unbearable. She began feeling dizzy and lightheaded, like the room was spinning around her. When she stood up, a sharp pressure built up in her chest, making it hard to breathe properly. Her mind felt cloudy, and simple tasks like reading or answering emails became a struggle. It was as if a thick fog had settled in her head, and nothing seemed clear. Sophie tried to push through it, thinking it was just stress from her move and work, but the symptoms weren't going away, they were only getting worse. At the same time, Rex's condition seemed to deteriorate further. He had always been an energetic dog, but now he barely moved. He lay on the couch most of the day, not interested in playing or going for walks. Sophie had been concerned about his behavior for a while, but now it was clear something was very wrong. He wasn't eating much anymore, and his once shiny coat had begun to look dull. Sophie tried to encourage him to eat, offering his favorite treats and even cooking him special meals, but Rex wouldn't touch any of it. It was like he had no energy or interest in anything. Sophie felt a growing sense of dread. She couldn't understand what was happening to them both. One night, after another exhausting day, Sophie climbed into bed, hoping for a good night's sleep. She had barely closed her eyes when she felt Rex jump up on the bed, his weight pressing down on the blankets. She thought he was just settling in as usual, but something felt different. Rex wasn't lying down like he normally did. Instead, he began moving around restlessly, pacing on the bed and pawing at the blankets. Sophie groggily opened her eyes and tried to push him away, but he was insistent. Rex's behavior was more urgent than it had ever been before. He barked loudly, a sharp, short sound that cut through the silence of the night. Sophie could barely keep her eyes open, feeling too tired and weak to respond. She couldn't understand why Rex was acting this way, and in her exhaustion, she brushed it off. "Rex, stop," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. But Rex wasn't listening. He started tugging at the blankets with surprising strength, as if trying to pull them off Sophie's body. He wasn't just being playful, he seemed desperate. Sophie tried to push him away again, but her arms felt too heavy and she could barely move. The pressure in her chest made it hard to breathe, and the dizziness made it difficult to focus. Sophie could barely keep her eyes open. She felt like she was sinking into the bed, unable to move or respond. Rex continued to tug, his barks becoming more frantic. In that moment, Sophie was too weak to realize that Rex was trying to warn her, trying to get her out of bed before it was too late. Suddenly Rex stopped tugging. Sophie heard him collapse onto the floor with a soft thud, and when she turned her head, she saw him lying there, barely moving. His breathing was labored and his eyes were half closed. Sophie's heart raced. Something was very wrong. She had no strength to get up, but the panic was starting to set in. She knew that Rex's strange behavior meant something serious, but it was only when she saw him lying on the floor, weak and helpless, that she understood just how bad things had gotten. Sophie tried to move, but her body refused to cooperate. The exhaustion had taken over, and she couldn't even muster the energy to check on him. The next day, Sarah came over to check on Sophie, but as soon as she stepped inside, she froze. The apartment felt different, stale and heavy. She immediately noticed how pale Sophie looked and how sluggish she seemed. Sophie was sitting on the couch, her face drained of color, with her eyes barely open. Rex was curled up beside her, not moving, just staring into space. Sarah's heart sank. She had seen Sophie go through tough times before, but this was different. "Sophie, you don't look good," Sarah said, her voice full of concern. "You need to leave this apartment. You're clearly not well, and Rex is in bad shape too." Sophie shook her head weakly. "I'm fine, Sarah. I just need some rest." But Sarah wouldn't hear it. "No, you're not fine. You look like you're sick. And Rex is barely moving. Something is wrong, and I think it's coming from this apartment. You have to get out of here." Sophie felt a wave of unease wash over her. She had been trying to ignore how terrible she felt, but Sarah was right. She had been feeling worse every day, and now it seemed like Rex was getting worse too. Sophie didn't want to believe that her home, the place she had worked so hard to make her own, could be the cause of everything. But Sarah's words hit her hard. "I don't want you staying here another day like this," Sarah insisted. "Come stay with me. Just for a while." Sophie agreed, though part of her felt guilty about leaving her apartment. She packed a small bag and Sarah helped her out the door, making sure Sophie didn't overexert herself. Sophie felt a strange mix of fear and relief. She didn't know what was happening, but leaving the apartment for a bit seemed like a good idea. Once they were settled at Sarah's, Sophie decided to visit her doctor. The idea of going to a doctor had felt unnecessary before, but now it seemed like the only option. She couldn't ignore her symptoms anymore, and with Rex's condition worsening, she needed answers. At the doctor's office, Sophie was tested for various things. Dr. Patel ran several tests and after reviewing the results, he sat down with Sophie. "There are some signs of mild toxicity in your blood," Dr. Patel explained. "Your oxygen levels are lower than they should be, and it looks like you're dealing with some degree of oxygen deprivation." Sophie's heart raced. She hadn't expected that. Dr. Patel continued, "This could be caused by a number of things, but I strongly suspect it's something environmental. It could be a gas leak, faulty ventilation, or something in the apartment that's affecting your health." Sophie's mind began to race. Could it really be her apartment? She had spent so much time there and now it seemed like it was making her sick. Dr. Patel advised her to leave her apartment for a while and have the place checked for any issues, especially gas leaks or other environmental hazards. Sophie nodded, feeling a growing fear in her chest. She had never imagined that her new home, the place where she was supposed to feel safe, could be the source of her illness. But now, everything pointed to it. The symptoms she had been feeling, the way Rex was acting, it all seemed to lead back to her apartment. Sophie realized that she couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong in her home and it was making both her and Rex sick. Sophie didn't know what to do next. After hearing from her doctor, she realized she needed to find out what was causing her and Rex to feel so sick. She reached out to a home safety inspector named Jake, hoping he could help. Sophie had heard good things about him and she knew he was experienced in checking homes for hidden dangers. Jake arrived the next morning, carrying a big black toolkit and a small handheld gas detector. Sophie felt a little nervous, but she was also desperate for answers. Jake began his inspection by walking through the apartment, checking all the usual places where problems could occur. He started with the kitchen, moving along the gas lines near the stove. He then checked the walls and the heater in the living room. Sophie watched him closely, feeling anxious as he went from room to room. Jake seemed calm though and didn't say much. When he reached the heating system, he attached the gas detector to the vent and turned it on. Sophie watched the small screen on the device as Jake moved it slowly over the area. After a few moments, the detector beeped and Jake's expression changed. We've got a problem," he said, looking at the screen. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Jake turned the screen toward her, and Sophie saw that the numbers were flashing. The detector was picking up a low but steady level of gas coming from the heater. Sophie's stomach dropped. "What is it?" she asked, feeling a wave of fear rush over her. Jake took a deep breath. "Carbon monoxide," he said. "It looks like your heating system has been leaking carbon monoxide into the apartment. The levels aren't dangerously high, but they're still above what's safe. This has been going on for a while." Sophie felt a cold chill run down her spine. Carbon monoxide? She had heard of it before but never really understood how dangerous it could be. Jake explained further. "Carbon monoxide is a silent killer. It's odorless, colorless, and it doesn't cause immediate symptoms. But over time, if you're exposed to it, it can cause fatigue, dizziness, headaches, and difficulty breathing, exactly what you've been experiencing. The symptoms start slowly and can get worse the longer you're exposed." Sophie felt dizzy just hearing him explain it. "So, Rex and I have been breathing this in for months?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake nodded. "Yes, and that's why your symptoms have been gradual. It's easy to overlook at first because the effects don't hit you all at once. You feel tired, then you start getting headaches, maybe a little lightheaded. But over time it gets worse. Both you and Rex have been affected by this slow leak." Sophie felt a wave of disbelief. All this time, she had been thinking that the exhaustion and sickness were caused by stress or some other reason. She never imagined that it was something so dangerous lurking in her own apartment. The idea that she and Rex had been poisoned without even knowing it made her stomach turn. Jake continued, "The good news is that the levels aren't high enough to be immediately life-threatening, but they're definitely not safe. You need to get this fixed, and you shouldn't be in the apartment until it's properly repaired." Sophie felt a deep sense of relief that they had finally figured out what was causing their problems, but the fear still lingered. She had been living in this apartment for months, unaware that the air she was breathing was slowly making her sick. "What should I do now?" she asked, feeling lost. Jake gave her a reassuring look. "First, you need to get some fresh air. Open the windows and leave the apartment. I'm going to call a specialist to come fix the heating system, and I'll help you make sure this doesn't happen again." Sophie nodded, but the weight of the situation was heavy on her shoulders. She realized how close she had come to something much worse. If Jake hadn't come to help, they might not have discovered the carbon monoxide leak in time. Sophie followed Jake's advice immediately. She opened every window in the apartment to let in fresh air, hoping it would help clear out some of the harmful carbon monoxide. She was relieved to finally get out of the apartment, but she knew it wasn't safe to stay there until the problem was fixed. Sarah insisted that Sophie stay with her for a few nights, and Sophie agreed. She packed a small bag and left the apartment, feeling a mix of fear and relief. During those next few days, Sophie stayed at Sarah's place. She rested, tried to take care of herself, and let her body recover. It was hard to shake the feeling that something dangerous had been lurking in her apartment for so long, but at least now she was getting the help she needed. Every day, Sophie thought about what had happened, about how she and Rex had been exposed to carbon monoxide for months without realizing it. She felt thankful that they hadn't gotten worse, but also terrified about how close she had come to something much more serious. The day after Jake's inspection, the specialist arrived to repair the heating system. They replaced parts of the system, sealed the leaks, and made sure everything was safe. Sophie was anxious to return to her apartment, but she knew it had to be done. After everything was fixed, she finally went back to her home, feeling a little nervous but also hopeful. The air smelled fresher and the apartment felt different, safer. The first morning back, Sophie woke up feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks: refreshed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't wake up with a heavy head or aching body. She felt more alert, her mind clearer. She stretched, took a deep breath, and smiled. The exhaustion that had been dragging her down for so long was finally gone. It was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She was amazed by how much better she felt just from being away from the apartment and getting fresh air. Rex seemed to be recovering too. When Sophie returned to the apartment, she found him wagging his tail and jumping around excitedly, just like his old self. He ran to greet her at the door, his energy back and his eyes sparkling with life. Sophie felt her heart lift as she watched him run around, his tail wagging wildly. It was as though he was a completely different dog, full of energy and happiness. Rex was back to being the playful companion she had adopted, and it made Sophie feel so relieved to see him like that again. As the days went by, Sophie and Rex both continued to feel better. Sophie reflected on everything that had happened and how close she had come to disaster. She realized that if she hadn't taken Sarah's advice and reached out to Jake, things could have gotten much worse. She had been so focused on work and the move that she hadn't paid attention to the small signs her body and Rex had been giving her. Rex's strange behavior, his constant tiredness and his attempts to warn her, had been signs that she almost ignored. Now, Sophie knew the importance of paying attention to those little warning signs in life. They could save you from much bigger problems. Sophie was grateful for the experience even though it had been scary. She had learned a valuable lesson about listening to her body, paying attention to the things that seemed out of place, and trusting her instincts. She knew she would never ignore those small signs again. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something with the experience she had just gone through. It was terrifying to think about how close she had come to something much worse, and she knew that she wasn't the only one who might be living in danger without even knowing it. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that sharing her story could help others. So, Sophie decided to post about her experience on social media. She sat down one evening, taking a deep breath before typing out the story. She told her followers how she had been living in her new apartment, feeling tired and unwell for weeks, thinking it was just stress from the move. But what she didn't know was that the air in her apartment was slowly poisoning her with carbon monoxide. Sophie shared how Rex's strange behavior, his tiredness, labored breathing, and strange attempts to warn her, had been the first signs that something wasn't right. Rex had saved her life without even knowing it. He had been the one to alert her to the danger in their home, even though she hadn't realized what was happening. Sophie wrote about how she had ignored the warning signs for so long, thinking it was just stress or exhaustion. She shared the moment she reached out to Jake, the home safety inspector, and how the carbon monoxide detector had revealed a slow but steady leak coming from the heating system. Sophie told her followers how she had been living with this invisible danger, not knowing how badly it was affecting both her and Rex. She wanted to make sure that others didn't ignore the same signs and put themselves in a similar situation. After posting her story, Sophie felt a sense of relief. She knew that by sharing her experience she was helping others become aware of the dangers of carbon monoxide poisoning. Sophie encouraged everyone to check their homes for potential hazards, especially when it came to gas leaks or faulty ventilation systems. She reminded her followers that it's easy to ignore small signs of trouble, but those signs could be life-saving. Pay attention to the little things, Sophie wrote in her post. If something feels off, trust your instincts and get it checked out. You never know what might be lurking in your home. Sophie also expressed her gratitude for Rex, who had unknowingly saved her life. She shared how thankful she was for him, for being by her side and helping her see the danger before it was too late. Sometimes, she wrote, the things we take for granted, like our pets, are the ones who protect us the most. Rex is my hero. The response to Sophie's post was overwhelming. People from all over commented, sharing their own stories and thanking her for raising awareness about the dangers of carbon monoxide. Some said they had never thought to check for gas leaks in their homes before, while others said they would be scheduling inspections as soon as possible. Sophie felt proud that she had made a difference, and that her story had helped others avoid the same dangers she had faced. Sophie learned an important lesson through all of this: never ignore the warning signs and always trust your instincts. She would never take her health or Rex's for granted again. And she knew that by spreading awareness she was helping others stay safe too. Sophie's life has changed in many ways since discovering the carbon monoxide leak. She now takes extra precautions to make sure her home is safe and healthy. She regularly checks her heating system, and she has installed carbon monoxide detectors to protect herself and Rex. Her apartment feels safer, and she feels more in control of her environment. Living with Rex, Sophie feels even more grateful for their bond. Rex isn't just a pet to her anymore, he's a true hero. Sophie believes that love, in all its forms, has the power to protect us, even in ways we might not understand. Rex's love and loyalty saved her life, even when she didn't realize the danger she was in. Their connection is stronger than ever, and Sophie knows she'll always cherish the bond they share. She feels lucky to have Rex by her side, keeping her safe and reminding her of the importance of paying attention to the little signs in life.